So let's start with the Cervantes and the Don Quixote. Say a bit why about you chose that.
I think Don Quixote has everything. I feel like I chose one of the least funny passages in the whole book. I had to sort of explain why. I mean, I really like this passage as well, but yeah, I mean, maybe the first thing to say is it's a very, very funny book, and if I had to just choose one book to take with me on the proverbial, then that would be the book, because I feel like it's an inexhaustible treasure, that book, actually. I've got, I think I've got 3 translations of it, and yeah, I don't think I'd ever sort of exhaust it, really. But that passage, what I like about that passage is, well, another thing to say about Don Quixote, it's written in 1605, so the first part came out in 1605, and so some people even talk about it as the first novel, certainly the first modern novel. And one of the things I like about that passage is it seems like Cervantes forgets later on, even a few pages later on, that Sancho's ass has been stolen. So the ass just comes back with no explanation, and Sancho's suddenly riding it again. And then later on, it's like Cervantes remembers again that it's gone, and it's sort of gone again. You know, it's just absolutely bizarre, you know. And the other thing about the novel is in 2 parts. So the second part was written or published in 1615, so 10 years later. And it's really interesting because in the second part, people are talking about what happened in the first part. So that's why I think it's so modern, you know. And one of the first things people are asking is like, what actually happened with the ass? You know, one time it was lost, and then another time it was back again. You know, what was going on there? And then Sancho, at some point, it says maybe it was a printer's error. You know? So it's just absolutely fabulous. So that's something about that book.
Yeah, and then in contrast, the Joyce, the Ulysses.
Well, I'm glad you stayed in the room for the duration. I mean, I think I was saying to Maitreyabandhu before, in a way that's sort of one of the more lyrical passages, I think, in Ulysses. And I mean, I think there's just so much to say about Ulysses, I think. I mean, I think I took about a decade slowly reading it. It's obviously a very difficult book, but again, I don't think I'd ever exhaust it. And I mean, one thing it's interesting about influences, I think, because I was thinking, you know, I know the format for Poetry East, and you know, we were going to follow the sort of standard format, and there would be, you know, what are your influences on your writing, and it's a bit like being asked, you know, there's that quote about autobiography, you know, when you decide you're going to write your autobiography, the first thing you decide is what you're not going to put in, something like that. And I think it's to do with, well, there's a quote from Frederick Jameson in a recent essay in the LRB, which I thought was fabulous, and he said something like, influence is not a kind of copying. I think that's the sort of fear I have about saying, oh, these are the sort of influences. It's almost like, oh, you know, you've sort of just sort of copied things. He says influence is it's permission, something like permission unexpectedly received to do things in new ways, something like that. And it's a sort of long quote. And for me, Ulysses is almost like an archetypal version of that. It just breaks all of the rules and just is, you know, is so radically different when it came out that it's something of that, I think.
I mean, Ulysses does have a kind of devoted following as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I'm not a
fan.
I'm not one of those devotees, but it does. And another influence for you is Beckett, isn't it?
Yeah.
He also has very much a devoted following.
Yeah. I was thinking about Beckett. I mean, I could easily have chosen something from Beckett. Well, you know, Joyce and Beckett talked a bit about as being like, Joyce was such a maximalist, you know, whereas Beckett's a minimalist. You know, this sort of very, very sort of slight in a way, but you know, real depth. Whereas almost like James Joyce in Ulysses wanted to bring everything in, and you know, you get a sense of that in that passage, don't you? It's like it's the, you know, the other thing about that passage is it's just the story of Stephen Dedalus and Harold Bloom going into a house and then leaving it, which in a way is what happens with my book. You know, and
not quite as much as that, but
no. we'll come on to that. You know, so it's a whole day. You know, obviously it's there's the whole thing about Bloomsday, and Ulysses unfolds over a whole day. But yeah, you get a sense that Joyce wanted just to bring everything in. You know, the whole universe. And,
indeed.
Yeah.
So let's move away from influences, go back to the beginning for you. I thought it'd be good to, I don't know why, I do know why actually, but it'd be nice to just talk about how your parents met.
Oh, okay.
The obvious place to start, isn't it?
It is. It's a straightforward question, isn't it? So yeah, my dad was Nigerian, my mum's English, and 1960s London. Maybe that's all I need to say. So my dad came here in the early 60s and was working in a factory in Barking. My mum was visiting the factory as a sort of health visitor or factory nurse. I've never really understood what a factory nurse is, but she was somehow visiting
looking
the factory.
after the factory, presumably.
Basically, yeah, and people therein, that's how they met. And
then you moved. Then you were brought up in Norfolk, weren't you?
Yeah,
so what was that like, being brought up in Norfolk? Say a bit about your childhood. My grandparents on my mum's side retired to Norfolk in the mid-70s, and then we were travelling backwards and forwards, and we moved there eventually. And I felt very visible. You know, you talk about the delight I take in being the centre of attention, sitting here, and I can sort of talk about it in those terms. It's like actually, you know, this mixed race family in rural Norfolk in the 70s. We weren't the only one, but it felt like we were. It's not a great exaggeration to say we were the only sort of mixed race family in the region. That's how it felt, you know. So I was just, I think, very, very self-conscious of that, you know. And my strategy, I think, was always humour to somehow fit in, you know. So that was a big thing. Yeah. And your father's strategy, I remember you telling that story about him being asked, "What did he eat?" Or would he? Your father?
Yeah, I was telling this story about my dad. He was a very extroverted person, to the extent where I was just embarrassed to walk through the centre of, you know, Swaffham with him, because he would be talking to people, like telling people not to bite their nails, you know, or, you know, people would be smoking and he'd talk to them about, you know, how bad that was, you know. So you can imagine as a, 12-year-old kid, like slightly self-conscious, how much I enjoyed that, you know. But yeah, there's a story about my dad which I tell, which says something about him. So he was, we'd go to church, and we were at a church barbecue. This is after we moved to a small village outside of Swaffham. And someone was wanting to know what people ate in Nigeria, and they were quite sort of hesitant, and it was like they took a lot of courage to ask this question, because they didn't want to offend my dad, and he's sort of eating a bit of chicken or whatever. They got the courage to ask, well, what do people eat in Nigeria? And he just said, missionaries. And that's, that sums up something of my dad in yes.
So when did writing kind of enter your life? Reading it or writing? Or, when did reading? Because you don't come from a literary. I mean, literate, but not literary. Careful with that.
It's an important distinction.
Yeah, it is. Distinctions are important.
Definitely. Yeah.
Literary.
Yeah. Well, I remember being at school, like at junior school, and it's like a precursor of Amazon. Like we used to get, we could order books and they would get delivered the next week. I mean, that was quick in those days. And I used to really sort of enjoy reading. Used to love comic books as well.
Marvel, and so at junior school I read a lot, I think, but then in high school I became more sort of as a sort of mathematical science type person. I was sort of more along those strands.
To me as well.
Much laughter around people who know Maitreyabandhu. I'll try not to get distracted into talking about mathematics and Maitreyabandhu.
Yes.
I'll try and draw a line there. So I went through school, went through sixth form, and part through university, just thinking, well, I'm just a sort of science geek, really. But then I had a friend who studied elsewhere, studied English literature, and she just recommended a couple of novels to me, To Kill a Mockingbird and Catcher in the Rye. And I just started reading again and really just, loved it, and piled up more and more books. Yeah.
And writing, where did writing enter your life? I mean, I remember reading a very early manuscript which you still haven't published.
Yeah.
It starts in the Brixton riots.
Yeah.
Say a bit about when writing, when you started writing and what you started writing.
Well, after university I went to work in Denmark, and I worked as a technical author, so I was writing instruction manuals, and people who read the novels may not be surprised that was that was the thing. But yeah, I had an aspiration then to try and write creatively as well. So but I think the decisive thing for my writing was being dumped unceremoniously by a girlfriend, and it was definitely like that was the start of writing seriously. It started, I think, in a way, start of spiritual life. I don't quite know how it sort of adds up in a way. But after that, I went and did some Avon courses. And it was, the first Avon course I did. So Avon run these week-long residential creative writing courses, and it just felt like, I've come home. Something like that, it felt like that. A bit like coming to the Buddhist Centre as well later.
And could you know any more about what was it particularly about being dumb that got you to write? The pain of it, the desire to make sense of it.
I think I'd had I've had a very good life, and I think it was the first serious bit of difficulty that I had, and it just really sort of threw me. So it was like, I just thought my life would just carry on along these smooth rails indefinitely, but obviously it doesn't do that. So it just really sort of threw me and got me sort of questioning, well, what is this? What am I doing? And when we talk about dukkha, and it was the first experience of serious dukkha, unsatisfactoriness that I'd experienced, I think.
And then you start that first novel that you were writing. That was, it couldn't be more different in a way than what the two novels you published. It starts. I think there's quite a vigorous sex scene at the start in the Brixton riots, as far as I remember.
Yeah.
I don't know why I remember that. I'm sure there are landscape elements as well. But they haven't stayed. But so how did you move from writing that, which was much more conventional novel, to the your first novel? How did you make that into Whatever Happened to Harold Absalon?
Well, I made that into Whatever Happened to Harold Absalon because of your influence.
Oh dear.
Blame has no place. But no, again, it's funny talking about influences. We can talk about books that we love, and definitely, there's so many influences. But I want to talk about you, Maitreyabandhu. This is, you were the first person who took an interest in my writing seriously. Just taking a manuscript and reading it, which it's a big thing, and you don't know what you're going to get, and so your interest, your encouragement, like reading the first manuscript, basically helped me just enormously, and that was I can't sort of say how important that was. It was because so many of us write, and it can be quite a lonely thing. But just having the belief, having a reader, is extremely. It's just crucial, and having a reader like you, is just I can't sort of express how much that meant and what a turning point that was.
It seemed to have meant that you'd stopped writing in that fashion.
Yeah. I mean, it did. I mean, it helped me to move away from what I was trying to write. I was trying to write a novel that I couldn't write, quite simply, in a voice that wasn't my voice. I mean, another Arbonne course I did early on, I got some advice which was something like, you need to write something conventional before you can experiment. So that I took that very seriously, to the extent that I spent about 10 years trying to finish that novel and not being able to. And in a way, it wasn't. I was going to say it wasn't bad advice. Maybe it was bad advice, but I don't, in a way, regret spending that time. I can think of it as like trying to, it's like an apprenticeship or something like that. But it wasn't my voice somehow.
I mean, the other thing that I was wondering is, it's good to say about how you got involved in Buddhism, and whether, there must be a relationship of your discovering writing and so on, and discovering the Dharma. So it'd be good to say a bit about how you got involved here and got involved in Buddhism.
Again, I think
I have a Bach concert in mind somewhere.
I think it was to do with suffering. My dad died in 2000, and in a way, that was like the start of really searching for something. So I did a degree in philosophy, but there was a concert. I went back to Copenhagen and sort of went to this concert with my mum. It's the first time my mum had left the country since the 1960s. We had to renew her passport and things like this, and we just happened to go to this concert, which was in the street where I used to live in Copenhagen, and it was John Eliot Gardner conducting Bach cantatas, and again, didn't come from a came from a literate family, but not a literary family. And just to come back to that.
Yeah, it's worth really stressing that.
But similarly with classical music, my dad, I remember, used to sort of listen to some classical music, but I didn't come from any sort of classical music background. But yeah, something happened in that concert which touched me very deeply. It was just after my dad died. I felt like a sort of very, very open to something, something beyond sort of our mundane world or something like that, without making too grand a sort of claim about it. It's sort of, so that that was also a sort of start of searching, and so I did a philosophy degree, and then I got interested in Buddhism through going to Birkbeck and studying in the evenings, and I came here thinking, this will just be a continuation of that. I'll do an evening course in Buddhism, and that'll be good. And I got something different to what I was expecting.
Yeah, cool.
I got order members. Actually, that was the thing.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, so for example, Maitreyabandhu, who's the caretaker here, he was one of the people who were leading my Buddhism course, and he basically he was talking about his life in a very, very sort of day-to-day way, talking about giving up smoking, giving up drinking, and basically it's almost like this is a lived experience. It's trying to live out some of the things I've been studying in a very abstract way, and also again seeing Jan of Archer talking about retreats. In a way, the content obviously went in as well, but there was just something about like something's going on in this place, that I feel I can't sort of pin down, but I just found it very, very, which just felt like it's very, very attractive in some way. Yeah. So.
And do you link your practice of Buddhism with the writing in your mind? Is that Is it one practice? Is it two passions?
It's one practice. I mean, the other thing I really liked about that Frederick Jameson essay in the London Review of Books, it was an essay about Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. So it's 50 years since that book was published. And that's often described as magic realism, isn't it? That sort of tradition of Latin American literature, inspired by Garcia Marquez. But what Frederick Jameson was saying was that's such a bad term for it, actually. And he was saying, actually, he's saying that Garcia Marquez really attends to the everyday. He really sort of concentrates on the real, and there's a marvel in the real, or something like that. And it's very interesting. He was also using the word concentration. So that really using the word concentration. He was saying Garcia Marquez, when he wrote that novel, didn't leave his house. He just stayed in his house and wrote the thing.
Wow.
And he also talks about from chapter to chapter, it's almost like he takes a subject and he really just concentrates his attention very, very fully on that subject. So I don't know, I just find it very, very interesting in terms of meditation and absorption and some of the language used, teaching meditation. And that's definitely my experience of writing. When it's going well, it is like a feeling of being completely absorbed in what I'm doing, and it's deeply, deeply satisfying. And reading, I think, can be like that as well at its best, can't it? When you're really sort of absorbed in the book. And he also talks about this sort of technical philosophical term of the identical subject-object. It's almost like you just sort of step out of that distinction or something like that. So yeah.
So let's move on to the novels, really, both of them. Whatever happened to Harold Absalon first, and then In the Absence of Absalon. So they're both novels concern the disappearance of Harold Absalon, the mayor's transport advisor. And both are a series of digressions, and then digressions on digressions. But I didn't realise how eventful the first one is until you read the second one. There's lots of playing with the genre of the detective genre, with all of its clues and red herrings and nail-biting ends of paragraphs, chapters. Both of them, particularly the second, the new novel, which I think sort of develops in the new novel, which is this kind of postmodern awareness of the reader. In the new novel, in the Absence of Absalon, there's a question about whether the author went to the loo between chapters, for instance, which is anyway. There we go. How would you characterise that kind of writing?
I don't know.
Plot-driven wouldn't be.
Well, I mean, one of the lovely things about having novels published is people tell you what they think about them, and I think that's really such a pleasure. And I find myself sort of disagreeing with what people are saying, because I think So one thing is some of the reviews have said, "Oh, the plot is inconsequential." I can understand why people are saying that, but I don't think it is, actually. I think there's a lot more in the plot than people have sort of realised, or something like that as well. And also...
people might include me.
Be careful what I say. I mean, it's the same with digression. People... I mean, even on the back of the second novel, there's all these quotes about how digressive it is.
Yeah.
Which again is quite a reasonable sort of thing, but personally I don't think of it as digressive. Actually, I know it's sort of I looked up the definition of what digression is, and I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's something like it's a side branch away from the main subject. And I think, well, what is the main subject of a novel? You know, I mean, we can sort of think of it as like, okay, there's a reality out there, and the novel tells a story about that reality, and it's sort of quite a straightforward sort of you know, relationship between the words and the reality, but it's not really. I don't think it's like that actually, is it? You know, so that's why I don't think it's digressive. I think, you know, the subject is the subject or something. You know, but the longer I sort of argue that, the more I undermine my own argument or something like that. Yeah.
But just to say something about this awareness of the reader. Like there's a lovely, very comic moment in the new novel where there's a question of whether all the readers are also in the forecourt. And this question of where the reader is looking at the character. You know, like, so we have to say that they're looking there, and that means you're sort of standing behind them looking. There's lots of concerns about where people are generally, but we'll come to that in a minute.
Well, I mean, again, I think about Don Quixote, and I mean, I don't actually like postmodernism in its sort of tricksy sort of some of the things where, you know, you get novels where the main character has the same name as the novelist. I mean, I'm sure that can work as well, but sometimes it feels a bit like a game or something like that. And but again, I go back to Don Quixote, where, you know, in Don Quixote, having said that, you know, the idea is that the manuscript the original manuscript was written by a Moor, and then it's translated, and Cervantes edits it, something like that. So you could, you know, this is from 400 years ago. So like the terms, you know, modernism, postmodernism, I think in a way they go back to there. But I don't know, it just seems like a reasonable question. Like, you know, we can pretend that there's a sort of omniscient narrator who like looks down and just sort of is not part of the story and just sort of tells what's going on. But again, it just seems a bit. I mean, you know, and I like reading novels like that. But then, in a way, there's a parallel tradition which sometimes is called anti-novels, and they're aware of themselves. It's a bit. I think it's almost like self-consciousness, like the fact that in the second part of Don Quixote they're talking about the first part. It's almost like a sort of self-consciousness, and I find that absolutely fascinating. And for me, it gives so much life to the work.
It's a little bit, isn't it, like, you know, in painting you get this tradition of the window of the world, you know, as if you're looking through a window onto a landscape. And then in modern painting you get this insistence that it's a painting. And, you know, truth to material and that sort of thing. There's an awareness of the materiality of writing, isn't there? Like in what there's this long digression. No, it's not a digression. Let's use that as a shorthand. About, you know, which side of the road you. It's really, really funny about which side of the road you drive and the problem of what happens when you get to a combine harvester and so on, and reflective clothing and so forth. And at the end of it, you say, and for those people who've never had a problem with that, welcome back. So after a long chapter discussing the intricacies of that. So it's very conscious of the reader in a certain sort of way. And the main character seems to be having his thoughts typed out and seems to be vaguely aware of that.
Yeah, well, you know, it's not dishonest to sort of pretend that, you know, I don't know, just, well, I mean, okay, so another way of talking about it, I think, is, you know, in terms of the detective novel, you know, we sort of think about, well, what's so enjoyable about detective novels? I really like reading some detective novels, and part of it is like, I think it's like trying to solve the mystery before the writer does, or something like that. It's like a sort of problem-solving thing that can come in, and you know, the fact is that, you know, we sort of want the writer to stay one step ahead of us in terms of like surprising us, you know, each time. So we can, you know, I really like immersing myself in that. But then you can also write about that. It's like, well, yeah. seems like a reasonable topic to bring in. You know, if you've got a detective and he sort of knows that he's trying to stay one step ahead of you,
Yes.
and you know, then it's like a more of a, it just seems like a conversation or something like that. And like, if he's trying to stay one step ahead of you, then he's going to be behind you, isn't he? Well, the reader's going to be behind the detective.
Yeah, yeah.
Obviously. Maybe it's just me. It's just trying to be, I think it's something about trying to be truthful, actually. You know, I mean, you know, so there's a sort of chapter at the end of the book about walking, and
it's explained quite carefully, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and it's like you know, so we say, okay, I'm just going to put one foot in front of the other, but actually, you know, the foot is not just in front of the other, is it? It's still to one side, but what's the next question, Michael?
So I also was wanting to talk about the fact, you know, that you've got Whatever Happened to Harold Absalon, which, you know, as I say, is positively pacey.
Yes.
What were you trying to do in the new novel? Were you trying to... You've also got the footnotes, which I wanted to come on to as well, but
yes.
What are you... Were you trying to extend something? What was your... Did you have an intention in the new novel? Did you think, okay, I want to continue with this?
I think the intention with the first book was just to try and find out what happened. You know, so in the first book, the publisher talked about it as a detective novel set on a bus, and it feels like the character got on the bus, and I just followed him on, and just wanted to sort of see what happened, really. So it's a bit like that, really. I mean, and with the second book, I don't have an intention. I mean, what I find that the writing I enjoy, and what I enjoy about writing, is just trying to discover what actually happens. You know, another way to talk about it is it's almost like each chapter is a problem that I somehow lock onto and want to solve. A friend of mine said, "Well, nobody else seems that worried about the problems that you're exploring, but for me, they are real and important problems that I just try and sort of follow." Yeah.
And the footnotes, what made you... So the footnotes look like they have no relation to the text, and I could work out they come at particular moments.
Yeah.
As if they're, you know, footnotes are commentaries on that bit, that's where they have the number there.
Yeah.
But you can't for the life of you work out why that's footnote. But but what brought you? Because they're in a completely different voice, aren't they, the footnotes?
They are, yeah, and it was intentional. So when I submitted the manuscript to Salt, the publisher, to Nicholas Royal, who's the editor, he gave me two bits of feedback about the manuscript. The first one was he thought it should be much shorter, because actually, to start with, I had 3 parts, and it was a long novel. So what I did actually was I took the first part, and that's what became the first book. The other thing he said, which I thought was very, very good, was he thought there should be, I think he said something like another character, you know, because you're very, very much in one character's head. And he said, well, maybe there should be another character. So that's how the footnotes came about. I don't know if that's what he meant, but that's how it sort of, that's how it came out, really.
He briefly had a dog for a while, didn't he?
Yeah, let's not mention the dog.
That wasn't going to fly. Then the other thing I was thinking, you know, reading the novel, it comes obviously over as a comic novel, but it makes you wonder what we mean by something being comic. The assumption of something being comic is that it's not serious somehow, but that seems to me a wrong assumption. Chekhov's plays are, you know, he insisted they were comedies. Nobody else. Anyway, but you know, and they you can see what he means. They're something that there seems to be something about comedy, which is about our human situation, as valuably as tragedy is about human situation. And the effect of comedy in the novels, particularly the new novel, seems to want to be comedy in that sense. that it's serious comedy. I don't know whether have you got any thoughts about the nature of comic writing and what we mean by comedy. If you mean.
Well, again, I go back to the touchstone for me of Don Quixote, where Don Quixote, the novel, is talked of as a wisdom novel, which I find very interesting, and in a way I don't know what to make of it, but it does make sense to me. It's just, in a way, it's inconsequential. Again, Don Quixote's read all these tales of chivalry, and then decides to go. I mean, you probably know the book, but. Decides to go off and be a knight, and this is long after knights have ceased to be roaming the earth, and he just gets into adventures, and it's just such a funny book, but it does communicate something profound, I think, at the same time, and maybe you can get closer to some things through comedy than you can through tragedy. I don't know.
I wonder whether it's somehow kind of trying to touch on the absurdity of our life, because that's the absurd is very important in both novels, particularly, and there being something serious about the absurd. The absurdity of our human minds, for instance, that go on and on.
And sort of the absurdity of the world around us, or something like that. We just have these sort of cliches and shortcuts, and they're helpful to sort of navigate through our day-to-day lives, but actually reality's not quite like that, And I mean, there's I remember hearing Harold Jacobson, novelist, on the radio, and he's often described as writes comic novels. I haven't read his stuff actually, but I mean, one of his things he was saying was that the sort of serious and tragic novels, he was relating it to religion and the sort of decline of religion, and it's almost like the sort of seriousness and religiosity goes on to sort of serious books. But he makes a very, very good defence of comedy and the comic, and how important that is in terms of talking about life as well.
And then the other thing I was going to mention about, there's a strong erotic theme in, I don't know, I've got much to say more about that, but in both books there's actually quite a strong erotic theme, albeit sort of disguised in the language. But then there's this sort of recurring motif of disappearance, of absence, of this weird thing in the both novels, but particularly in the new novel, about a sort of lack of reality, because it's so much from the protagonist, it's so much in his mind. So so-called real world is pushed right away. It takes something like 4 chapters for him to get a key out of his pocket, something like that. I don't know if it's quite that long, but it feels like that.
That's an understatement.
Is it? It takes quite a while to get a key out of his pocket. So, ordinary reality is sort of pushed away, and yet there's sort of something hyper-real about it. So it seemed to me there's this sort of playing between appearance and disappearance, absence, reality as being pushed away, but also something hyper-real. Can you say anything about disappearance and whether does that link to your own life? Does that link to your Buddhist practice? Do you think? I mean, I know these things aren't self-conscious in that way.
I don't know. I mean, talking about anti-novels and novels, in a way, anti-novels just have to use the form that they're given or something like that. So, if it's a detective novel, there's certain things you need to do. So I don't know any more than that, really. I mean, maybe the other thing I could say is that in a way, the inspiration for the books was a man in Norwich I used to see when I was growing up, and so he sort of, let's say like black faces in Norfolk were rare. I mean, and there's a black man who's well loved still in Norwich, who he used to walk into the traffic on the inner ring road in Norwich with washing up gloves on, and used to direct the traffic. And it was just very benign character, and people really loved him actually, and so in a way that he was the starting point for the book, and the idea was just the sense that actually, okay, what if this man is a detective? You know, but you're never quite sure whether he's a real detective or whether he's lost his mind. So that was sort of I've always been interested in just like trying to walk that line between those two different possibilities or something like that. Yeah.
So we'll need to wind up, but I wanted to ask that classic question, which is, why do you write? I mean, I remember years ago when we first became friends, I remember you saying to me, I write on the second floor of Costa, was it?
An unnamed
unnamed cafe. Near an unnamed railway station. It really struck me then that I thought, yes, you're definitely a writer. I don't know why, but there's something about writing often involves a kind of ritual to make it possible. There's a spell to make it possible, which it's difficult for other people to understand. So why do you know why you write?
No. I mean, it's interesting. For me, the thing about finding out how to write, is such a big thing, isn't it? Because it's so individual, and it's definitely some sort of ritual, and it's sort of important for me to follow. All I can say is, like, when I'm not writing, I think, well, like, what's the point, or something like that, I mean, I think, when we talked about the first book, you were talking about me being disciplined or something like that, and and I was saying, and then it doesn't feel like I'm disciplined with my writing. It's more like, well, it's like eating and drinking or something like that. Just something is seriously wrong if I'm not doing it or something like that. I mean, I could analyse myself, psychoanalyse myself, but maybe I'll just say leave it there or something.
And then let's finish with, so why should we read? That's one end of the stick, is someone writing, but why should we read? My guess is that reading is getting more and more rare. People are still buying books, but I wonder whether reading is becoming itself more and more rare. Why should we read?
The thing that comes to mind, so we were recently in Malaysia, and I did a book event there, and Malaysia is an interesting country. You've got so many different groups, so many different sort of communities there, and that reading event was what gave me a sense of what it was. So you had all sorts of people reading all sorts of different work, and I felt like this event sort of defines, in a certain way, defines this city. The intimacy of sort of understanding people's lives and the sort of diversity of people, but also the universality of our experience or something like that. The short answer is I don't know, but there's definitely something about that event where I felt like I really sort of got a sense of what it was like being in that city, and feeling a sense of connection with people.
So great. Let's leave it there. Thank you very much, Manjusiha.